Hollywood, California, 1969. The party had been going for 3 hours, and Muhammad Ali was holding court the way he always held court. Loud, luminous, the gravitational center of every room he entered, pulling people into his orbit whether they wanted to go or not. It was a private gathering at a producer's home in the hills above Sunset, the kind of party where the guest list was assembled by reputation rather than friendship, where everyone was somebody and everybody knew it. Actors, directors, athletes, the particular species of Los Angeles wealth that moved between all three categories without belonging fully to any of them. Ali was the brightest thing in the room, he always was, but somewhere across that room, nursing a glass of water near the garden doors, stood a man that almost nobody at this party had correctly identified, and in approximately 40 minutes, Muhammad Ali was going to make the single most embarrassing miscalculation of his social life. The host was a film producer named Richard Cavanaugh, a heavy-set man in his 50s with the satisfied expression of someone who had spent 30 years arranging rooms full of interesting people and watching what happened. Cavanaugh knew both men. He had worked with Bruce Lee on a project that had not yet materialized into anything. He had socialized with Ali through the boxing world's intersection with Hollywood that was, in 1969, more extensive than most people realized. He had not introduced them yet. He was, by several accounts, deliberately waiting to see what happened when he did. He was, by those same accounts, not disappointed. The man near the garden doors was Bruce Lee, 28 years old, 135 pounds of something that looked, in a social context, entirely unremarkable. He was wearing a dark collared shirt and plain trousers, period appropriate, his short black hair neatly placed, his defined face relaxed in the particular way it relaxed in public situations, present, observant, generating nothing that demanded attention. He was not performing for the room. He was not networking. He was watching, the way he always watched, with the quality of attention that gathered information without announcing itself. Several people at the party had spoken to him and found him pleasant, interesting, somewhat quiet. None of them had understood what they were standing next to. That was, depending on how you looked at it, either his greatest social gift or the room's greatest collective failure of perception. Ali noticed him 40 minutes in, not because Bruce Lee did anything to be noticed. He didn't. Ali noticed him the way dominant presences notice the only other still point in a moving room. Everyone else was in motion, circulating, performing, angling toward him or away from him in the complex social choreography of an industry party. Bruce Lee was simply standing, not uncomfortably, not strategically, just standing, watching the room with an expression of mild and genuine interest, entirely at ease inside his own stillness. Ali, who read rooms as a professional matter, felt the stillness across the distance. He angled toward it. This was not unusual. Ali angled toward interesting things. He had no way of knowing, in that moment of initial orientation, that the interesting thing was going to angle back. He made his way across the room with the ease of a man parting water. People moved for him without being asked. Conversations paused as he passed. Hands reached out and he clasped them briefly, names exchanged and forgotten. He arrived in front of Bruce Lee and looked down the familiar 6 inches and across the familiar 90 pounds of difference. "I don't think we've met," Ali said, extending his hand. Bruce Lee took it. Bruce Lee. Ali smiled, the full performance smile, generous and slightly condescending in the specific way that very large men smile at very small ones. "Ali," he said, though the introduction was unnecessary. His face was the most recognized face in the world. "I know," Bruce Lee said simply, and left the reply exactly there. Ali's smile held. He looked Bruce Lee up and down with the evaluating eye he brought to everything physical. "You one of these kung fu guys?" he said, and the question had in it the lightness of a man who has already decided the answer doesn't particularly matter. "Something like that," Bruce Lee said. "What does that mean?" Ali said, amused now.
It means the categories aren't quite right, Bruce Lee said. Ali laughed. The laugh was real. He appreciated a good answer, and it was a good answer. He took a sip of whatever he was holding and considered the small, precise man in front of him. "You fast?" he asked. It was the question he asked everyone physical, the question that served as his primary taxonomy of human athletic value. "Depends," Bruce Lee said. "On what?" said Ali. "On what you're measuring against," Bruce Lee said. Ali set down his glass. He had been at this party for 3 hours, and this was the first conversation that had his complete attention. Behind and around them, the party continued its orchestrated bustle. Someone was playing piano in the adjacent room, something jazz-adjacent and unobtrusive. Glasses were refilled. Laughter arrived in waves from somewhere near the pool. Kavanaugh, across the room, noticed the conversation forming and began, with the unhurried patience of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, to move in its direction. "Here's what I want to know," Ali said, lowering his voice slightly, which was its own form of attention. Ali quieting down meant Ali was concentrating. "All these martial arts guys, kung fu, karate, all of it. You see them on TV, they break boards, they jump around. It all looks very impressive." He paused. "But none of them have ever fought a real fighter, not a trained boxer, not someone who hits back for a living." Bruce Lee looked at him steadily. The expression on his face had not changed. "You're right that most of them haven't," he said. Ali blinked. He had expected a defense. The agreement wrong-footed him slightly. "So you agree with me?" "I agree that breaking boards has nothing to do with fighting," Bruce Lee said. "Wood doesn't move. Wood doesn't hit back. Wood has no intent. Fighting is an entirely different question." "And what's the answer?" Ali said. Bruce Lee's eyes were level, calm, and carrying something behind them that Ali, who had looked into the eyes of every serious fighter he'd ever faced, did not immediately have a category for. "That depends," Bruce Lee said again, "on who's asking and why."
The piano continued in the next room. Kavanaugh arrived at the periphery of the conversation and stood there quietly, listening, a small smile on his face that he didn't bother to hide because nobody was looking at him. 3 other people had drifted nearby, not part of the conversation but orbiting it, drawn by the particular gravitational event of watching Ali genuinely engaged rather than performing engagement. The room around them was full of noise and movement. The conversation occupied its own pocket of stillness. "All right," Ali said. He was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who has decided to test something. "Let me ask you something. You know my jab?" Everyone in the room knew his jab. Everyone in the world knew his jab. It was perhaps the most famous single weapon in the history of combat sports, fast enough that camera technology had struggled to capture it, a punch that had reordered the faces and careers of the greatest heavyweights of a decade. "I know it," Bruce Lee said. "Could you see it coming?" Ali asked. There was showmanship in the question, but also genuine curiosity. He had asked versions of this to dozens of fighters, coaches, athletes from other disciplines. Nobody had ever given him an answer he found unsatisfying more than once. "I could see what comes before it," Bruce Lee said. Ali's expression shifted. "Before it?" "The commitment," Bruce Lee said. "Every strike begins before it begins. There's a moment of decision that the body makes visible, very slightly, before the strike arrives. If you can read that moment, the strike itself is almost irrelevant." Ali was quiet for 3 full seconds. That was, by the accounts of people who knew him, an extremely unusual duration of silence for Muhammad Ali. "You're saying you could read my jab?" Not a question. Processing. "I'm saying I'd try," Bruce Lee said. Then, "I'd probably get it right." The piano stopped in the next room. Whether by coincidence or the particular atmospheric sensitivity of a good piano player, it stopped at that exact moment, and the silence from the adjacent room arrived like a held breath. Ali looked at Bruce Lee for a long moment.
Then he did the thing that nobody who heard about it afterward found surprising, because it was entirely consistent with who he was, with the absolute bedrock confidence that was not performance, but foundation, not ego, but the simple structural certainty of a man who had never been wrong about his own abilities in any arena that mattered. He set down his glass, he straightened, and he said, "Okay, hit me." The three people who had been orbiting the conversation stopped moving. Kavanaugh's small smile became something larger. The party continued in the background, entirely unaware, the jazz filling back in from somewhere, the pool laughter carrying on. But in this particular corner of the garden room, time had reorganized itself around a pivot.
"I'm sorry," Bruce Lee said, not because he hadn't heard, because he wanted to hear it again with the room as witness. "Hit me," Ali said, and the smile was full now, the performance and the genuine certainty completely merged. "You say you're fast, you say you can read the setup, so hit me, right here." He pointed to his own jaw with one finger, the gesture casual and enormous with confidence, the gesture of a man pointing to something he knows absolutely cannot be reached. "If you can touch me, I'll believe everything you said. If you can't—" He let it finish itself. The smile completed the sentence. "Right here. I won't move. I'll just stand here. One shot, if you can land it." 14 people were close enough to hear this exchange. Some of them were watching Ali. Some were watching Bruce Lee. All of them were watching for the same thing, the small man's retreat, the graceful social exit, the diplomatic deflection that would allow everyone to move on. It was the expected thing. It was the proportionate thing. You don't accept a physical challenge from Muhammad Ali at a cocktail party in the Hollywood Hills. You don't do that. Nobody does that. Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment that several witnesses described as the quietest moment of the evening. His expression had not changed from the expression it had held through the entire conversation, the same level, unperformed, complete attention look that Kavanaugh recognized from their previous meetings, the look that meant that Bruce Lee was not in the room the way everyone else was in the room, that he was operating from a place slightly to the left of normal social reality, a place where the usual rules of performance and presentation had been set aside in favor of something more fundamental. He looked at Ali. He looked at the jaw Ali was pointing to. He looked back at Ali's eyes. "You're sure?" Bruce Lee said. It was not quite a question. "I'm sure," Ali said. The smile was enormous now. He was enjoying this. He looked around briefly at the witnesses, a performer acknowledging his audience. "You won't move?" Bruce Lee said. "I won't move," Ali confirmed. "One shot, right there." Bruce Lee nodded. He lowered his glass to a nearby table with careful, unhurried precision. He turned to face Ali squarely. He rolled his neck once, a small movement. He shifted his weight, barely, a few degrees, the kind of weight shift that is visible only to people who know what to look for. And then he looked at Ali with an expression that was, for the first time in the conversation, completely without social content of any kind. No pleasantness, no engagement, no conversational warmth. Just the look. The look that lived underneath everything else. The look that Dan Inosanto knew, and Ed Parker knew, and every person who had ever stood across from Bruce Lee in a training context knew. The look that meant every unnecessary thing had been set aside, and what remained was the thing itself. Ali was still smiling, but something, very slightly, changed in the smile, a small involuntary recalibration, the body knowing something the conscious mind hadn't caught up to yet, the body saying, "This is different now." 3 seconds passed in the garden room of a Hollywood Hills house in 1969, while Muhammad Ali stood with his arms at his sides, and Bruce Lee stood across from him, and 14 people stopped breathing. Then Bruce Lee moved. Nobody saw the hand.
That is not a figure of speech. That is not dramatic embellishment for the purposes of this story. Of the 14 people standing close enough to witness what happened in that garden room, not one of them, not a single person, saw the actual movement of Bruce Lee's hand between the moment it left its resting position and the moment it arrived at its destination. What they saw was Bruce Lee still, then Bruce Lee still again, and in between those two stillnesses, a sound. A sound like a single quiet note struck on a percussion instrument, not loud, contained, precise, and Muhammad Ali's head had moved. Not much, 2 inches, maybe 3, an involuntary backward lean, the body's autonomic response to contact arriving faster than the nervous system could process and redirect. The head moved back 2 inches and then returned to where it had been, and Ali stood in exactly the same position he had been standing in, arms at sides, and his expression had changed completely. The smile was gone. Not wiped away dramatically, not collapsed in pain or shock, simply gone, the way a light goes out when someone finds the switch, a clean and total absence where the smile had been. What replaced it was something that the witnesses struggled to describe consistently across the various accounts that surfaced over the years. Some said he looked confused. Some said focused. One person, a stuntman named Carl Weathers, who was at the periphery of the group, said it most precisely in a private conversation 30 years later. He looked like a man who had just discovered a room in his house he didn't know was there. 2 full seconds of silence. Then Ali raised one hand slowly and touched his own jaw, the place Bruce Lee had pointed to, the place Ali had guaranteed was unreachable. He pressed 2 fingers against it and held them there, not in pain because there was no injury. Bruce Lee's control was absolute, and the contact had been calibrated to make a point rather than cause damage, but in the particular way a person touches the spot where lightning struck to verify that the ground is real and the event actually happened. His fingers came away from his jaw. He looked at Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee had not moved from the position he'd occupied after the strike, had not stepped back, had not lowered his eyes, had not adjusted his expression into anything victory-shaped. He stood in the same place with the same look, waiting, the way a proof waits after the final line has been written, patient with the time it takes for the reader to verify the work. "Do it again," Ali said. The same words, the same voice, but entirely different this time, stripped of the performance register, the showman quality gone. What remained was something rawer and more interesting, the voice of a man who has encountered a genuine problem and wants to solve it, which was, underneath everything else Muhammad Ali had ever been or pretended to be, the most fundamental thing he was. 14 people in the garden room collectively understood that the party was over. Not literally. The music was still playing, the pool crowd was still audible, someone was still laughing about something near the kitchen. But the party they had come to was over, and something else had replaced it, something that had no name and no host and no guest list, something that had simply arrived uninvited and taken the room. Nobody left, nobody spoke, nobody reached for their glass. Bruce Lee looked at Ali. "Same place?" he said. "Same place," Ali confirmed. He reset, straightened slightly, squared his shoulders, chin level. The classic upright Ali stance, the posture of absolute confidence that had been his public signature for a decade. He was not smiling. He was, visibly, actually trying now, bringing the genuine machinery of his athletic intelligence to bear on the problem of not being touched on his own jaw by a man he had invited to try. His eyes were tracking, his weight was distributed, every lesson of every training session and every professional fight of his career was assembled behind his eyes and focused on the small, precise man in front of him. "Ready," Ali said. Bruce Lee moved.
Nobody saw the hand again. What they saw was the same: stillness, then stillness, and in between a sound and a movement. Ali's head moving back, this time perhaps an inch and a half, a marginally smaller backward lean because his body had marginally updated its expectation of incoming contact, and his nervous system had responded a fraction faster. But the contact had still arrived. The jaw had still been touched again. Same location, same controlled precision. The proof had been re-demonstrated in case there was any ambiguity in the first demonstration.
Ali stood for a moment without speaking. Around him, the 14 people were maintaining their collective stillness with the discipline of people who understand that any sound or movement from them will shatter something that cannot be reassembled. Kavanaugh, near the edge of the group, had his arms folded and was looking at the floor with an expression of private satisfaction that he was being careful not to let become visible to the room. He had known, when he arranged for both men to be present this evening, that something interesting would occur. He had not known exactly what shape it would take. The shape it had taken exceeded what he'd anticipated. "How?" Ali said, the same single word he had used in the gymnasium a year earlier, in the session that only 9 people had witnessed. Just how, the question beneath which all the other questions lived. "Your eyes moved before I did, both times. A quarter second before the strike, your eyes shifted very slightly, not to where you thought the threat was, but away from where you thought it wasn't. Your body was predicting the wrong thing in the right direction." Ali absorbed this. "You're telling me my eyes gave away your move?" "I'm telling you your eyes were trying to solve the problem before the problem existed," Bruce Lee said, "which is intelligent, but I wasn't doing what your eyes expected, so they solved for the wrong version of the problem." A pause. "Most people's eyes do that. It's not a weakness, it's just how anticipation works." "And yours don't?" Ali said. It was not quite a question. "Mine watch the source," Bruce Lee said, "not the prediction." Ali was quiet for what felt in the compressed time of that garden room like a very long interval. Then he looked around at the 14 witnesses, really looked at them, the performer's scan, reading the room, and then looked back at Bruce Lee. And then Muhammad Ali, the most verbally dominant human being in the sport of boxing and possibly in American public life, did something extraordinary. He said nothing. He simply nodded once, slowly, and the nod contained everything that his silence was too rare and too significant to require words to fill. The garden room exhaled. Someone near the back, one of the orbiting witnesses who had been drawn in without fully understanding what they were being drawn into, let out a breath that was almost a laugh, the laugh of released tension rather than amusement. A glass was picked up, weight shifted. The frozen tableau of 14 people reassembled itself into the ordinary motion of a party, slowly, the way ice melts, not all at once, but from the edges. But Ali hadn't moved yet. He was still standing in the same spot, and he was looking at Bruce Lee with an expression that Kavanaugh, who was watching him specifically, would later describe as the most undisguised expression he had ever seen on Ali's face. "That thing you said," Ali said quietly, "about watching the source instead of the prediction. I do that in fights. I do exactly that." "I know," Bruce Lee said. "I've watched your fights." "Then you know it doesn't work on me the same way," Ali said. "It's different when you're moving," Bruce Lee said. "When you're moving, the source changes every half second. There's more to read, but the reading is faster. And you can read it." "I've been practicing reading it for 15 years, Bruce Lee said simply. Another silence. This one different in texture. Not the held breath silence of before, but the settling silence of 2 people arriving at mutual respect from opposite directions, which is the most stable form of respect there is. "You want to go somewhere and actually work?" Ali said. It was not the question anyone expected next. Several of the witnesses looked up from the social motion they had resumed. "A gym," Ali clarified. "Not here. Somewhere proper.
I want to understand what that was." He gestured briefly toward his jaw, the gesture small and private, nothing like the expansive pointing that had started the evening. "I've been in boxing since I was 12 years old, and nobody has ever. I want to understand it." Bruce Lee looked at him for a moment. The social warmth had returned to his expression, a controlled and calibrated warmth, the warmth of someone who has decided a person is worth continuing to engage. "Call Ed Parker. He has a gym in Pasadena. Clean floor, good light. I'll be there." They met 3 days later. That session has been described elsewhere and in other contexts, but what matters here is the bridge, the moment in the garden room that made the session possible, the social encounter that cut through every layer of performance and reputation and public identity and arrived in under 3 minutes at the thing underneath. Two people who had each devoted their entire lives to understanding what the human body was capable of, meeting each other across the full width of their differences and finding, in those differences, the outline of something shared.
The party continued for another 2 hours after that. Ali circulated. Bruce Lee returned to his position near the garden doors. They did not speak again that evening, and nobody watching would have identified the exchange as anything other than a brief conversation between two men at a Hollywood party. The 14 witnesses talked about it among themselves in the immediate aftermath, and then, gradually, in the weeks and months that followed, less and less, the way unusual things become usual through the passage of time and the requirement of ordinary life. Most of them never gave public accounts. The ones who did gave fragments, careful, partial, always with the qualifying note that no recording existed, that what they were offering was memory, and memory was imperfect, and the event had been brief. But the event had not been brief. The event had been 3 seconds, twice, and in those 6 combined seconds, something had been established that no length of conversation or volume of testimony could have established as completely. Something had been proven in the only language that proof of this kind can be offered, not words, not argument, not philosophical position, but physical reality, arriving at a jaw that had been publicly guaranteed as unreachable, and reaching it again. The footage was never released, because there was no footage. There was only the room and the 14 people and the piano that had started again in the next room, and Muhammad Ali standing in a garden in the Hollywood Hills with 2 fingers pressed to his jaw and an expression on his face that the world never got to see, because the world had not been invited to this particular party, and some things that happen at parties stay at parties, and some things that stay at parties are the most significant things of the evening. The story traveled. Of course it did. Stories like this always travel, not through newspapers, not through press releases, but through the telephone of people who trust each other, through the long chains of connection that link practitioners and trainers and the people adjacent to both. It arrived in boxing gyms and martial arts schools and film sets and private conversations in the manner of all true stories, changed slightly in each retelling, the details slightly different, the number of witnesses expanding or contracting depending on the account, but the essential fact unchanged. The fact was simple. The fact was this: Muhammad Ali had pointed to his own jaw and invited Bruce Lee to touch it, and Bruce Lee had touched it, twice, before Ali's eyes could follow the hand that touched it. Ali went back to boxing in 1970. He reclaimed everything they had tried to take from him. He fought Frazier and Norton and Foreman and everyone else the era offered, and he beat most of them, and the ones he lost to he found in rematches, and the overall record of his career is one of the most extraordinary athletic documents the 20th century produced. He was asked about Bruce Lee in interviews several times after Lee's death in 1973. He always answered carefully. He always said something warm and something measured, and he never said the specific thing that the people who were in that garden room understood him to mean. He didn't need to. The people who needed to know knew.
Bruce Lee made Enter the Dragon in 1973 and died before it was released, before he could see what the world decided to do with what he had made. He was 32 years old, and the gap between what he had accomplished and what he had been building toward was still enormous, still full of the work he had planned and not yet done, still carrying the shape of the things he would have continued to demonstrate if time had allowed. He left behind a philosophy, a body of technique, a small number of people who had trained with him closely enough to understand something of what he actually was, and a much larger number of people who had encountered him briefly or at a distance and carried forward a fragment, a story, an impression, a moment. Some of those people were in a garden room in Hollywood in 1969. Some of them are still alive. None of them will tell the complete version of the story because no single one of them has it. They each have a piece, a fragment, the angle their position in the room afforded them. The complete version exists only in the combination of all 14 pieces and in the specific quality of the silence that fell over the garden room after the second time Bruce Lee's hand arrived at Ali's jaw before Ali's eyes could follow it. What that silence contained is not reducible to language. It contained something that 6 seconds of physical reality had placed in the room, and the room had absorbed, and the 14 people had received and carried forward in the way that genuine things are carried forward, not as facts, but as understanding, as a shift in the map of what is possible, as evidence against the most limiting assumption that human beings consistently make about each other and about themselves, that size is the measure, that mass is the argument, that the largest presence in the room is by definition the most dangerous one. Bruce Lee spent his life disproving that assumption. He disproved it in training halls and gymnasiums and private demonstrations, and one very particular evening at a party in the Hollywood Hills, where a man who was 6'3" and 220 pounds pointed to his own jaw and said, "Touch me," and the man who was 5'7" and 135 pounds touched it before the first man's eyes could tell him it had happened. That is the whole story. It needs nothing added to it. The numbers do the work. The 6 seconds do the work. The 2 inches of involuntary backward lean do the work. The silence does the work. And the single word that Muhammad Ali said, standing in a garden with 2 fingers on his jaw, the word he said before the conversation resumed and the party continued and the world went back to being the ordinary size it usually is, that word does the most work of all. The word was again.
It is always again. For every person who encounters something that exceeds their model of what is possible, the response, if they are genuinely great, if they are made of the right material, if they are at the core of what they are, a person who wants to know, rather than a person who wants to be right, the response is always the same word. Not denial, not deflection, not the ego's retreat into the comfort of its existing categories. Again. Do it again. Let me feel it again. Let me try to solve it again, knowing now what I didn't know before, bringing all of what I am to the problem of what you are, because the problem of what you are is the most interesting problem in this room and possibly in this city, and I am not going to walk away from an interesting problem just because the first encounter with it was humbling. Humbling is not the same as defeating. Humbling is information. Humbling is the beginning of understanding if you are brave enough and honest enough and large enough in your actual self to let it be that, rather than something to survive and move away from as quickly as possible. Ali was brave enough. That is what the word again tells you about him. Not that he had been surprised, but that his response to surprise was to lean into it rather than away. That beneath the performance and the showmanship and the public certainty was a man who genuinely wanted to know things, who found the boundary of his knowledge not threatening, but interesting, who understood at some deep and unperformable level that the encounter with a thing that exceeds your current model is not a defeat, but an education, if you let it be. And Bruce Lee. What does this moment tell you about Bruce Lee that you didn't already know? Perhaps only this. that he went to a party in the Hollywood Hills in 1969 and stood near the garden doors with a glass of water and watched the room with the eyes that watched everything. And when the moment arrived, the moment that was always going to arrive, in one form or another everywhere he went, the moment when someone large and confident and publicly celebrated pointed to themselves and said, "Touch me," he didn't hesitate, and he didn't perform, and he didn't make anything of it afterward. He just did the thing he had spent 15 years learning to do. He touched what he was invited to touch. He proved what could be proved, and then he picked up his glass and returned to watching the room. That was Bruce Lee. Not the movies, not the posters, not the legend that grew in the decades after his death into something mythological and slightly unreal. This, a man in a dark collared shirt at a party, doing exactly what he had trained to do, with exactly the force required and no more, and then setting it aside and going back to being a person at a party, because the demonstration was complete and the point had been made, and anything added to it would have been decoration, and Bruce Lee had no use for decoration. He kept only what worked. He threw everything else away. What was left was very small, but it was real. And in 6 seconds, in a garden room in Hollywood in 1969, in the gap between two stillnesses and the sound of two contacts and the backward lean of the most famous jaw in boxing, real was more than enough. If you've made it this far, you understand something now that most people spend their whole lives arguing against. The limit isn't where you've been told it is. It never was. Subscribe, because every story on this channel exists to prove exactly that.